In Goodfellas, power looks effortless. Jimmy Conway moves through the criminal world with calm authority, making decisions quickly, trusting his instincts, and always appearing one step ahead of everyone else. He is the man who turns chaos into opportunity, who never seems rattled by violence, betrayal, or pressure. To the audience, Jimmy represents the fantasy of absolute control, the belief that intelligence and nerve are enough to dominate a brutal world without being consumed by it. Crime, in this version of reality, looks dangerous but manageable, as long as the right mind is in charge. But the real story behind that character is far darker, far quieter, and far more disturbing. The man Jimmy Conway was based on, James Burke, did not glide through power with confidence. He lived under it. Every dollar he earned increased his fear. Every success tightened the pressure around his mind, and every new associate became a potential threat. Where the film shows control, real life reveals paranoia. Where the movie shows leadership, the truth exposes isolation. Burke's story is not about mastering the criminal world, but about how long-term exposure to violence, secrecy, and suspicion slowly dismantles the person at the center of it. This is not a story about a legendary heist or a brilliant mastermind. It is a story about what power does to the human mind when there is no exit, no safety, and no trust left. By comparing the cool illusion of Jimmy Conway with the psychological collapse of James Burke, this video exposes the dark cost Hollywood leaves out. The moment where control turns into obsession, success becomes danger, and power begins its quiet march towards self-destruction. In Goodfellas, Jimmy Conway is designed to look like the perfect criminal mind. A man who never hesitates, never panics, and never appears overwhelmed by the violence unfolding around him. He speaks with certainty, moves with confidence, and gives orders as if every outcome is already calculated. When others lose control, Jimmy looks calm. When danger rises, he looks focused. This portrayal creates a powerful illusion that some people are simply built to handle endless pressure. That intelligence and experience can neutralize fear itself. To the viewer, Jimmy is not just surviving crime, he is mastering it, turning risk into routine and chaos into profit. What makes this illusion so convincing is how carefully fear is removed from the frame. Jimmy Conway is rarely shown second-guessing, rarely shown alone, and almost never shown confronting the long-term consequences of his decisions. Violence appears functional, betrayal appears manageable, and loyalty feels like a stable currency. Even when things go wrong, Jimmy looks like a man already planning the next move. This version of power suggests that control is a permanent state, something a sharp mind can maintain indefinitely. It reassures the audience that dominance, once achieved, can be sustained through discipline and nerve alone. But this image depends entirely on what the film chooses not to show. It hides the mental cost of waking up every day knowing that one mistake, one word, or one wrong look could trigger arrest or death. It compresses years of stress into brief, dramatic moments, then resolves them quickly so the character can return to looking composed. In reality, pressure does not arrive in clean scenes. It accumulates slowly, eroding judgment and distorting perception. The myth of Jimmy Conway assumes that fear can be managed like a business expense, but fear does not stay contained. It spreads, it lingers, and it eventually reshapes how decisions are made. This is why the cinematic version of Jimmy feels almost superhuman. He appears insulated from doubt, as if confidence itself were a shield. Yet that confidence is a narrative shortcut, not a reflection of how power actually works over time. Real control does not freeze the mind in a permanent state of clarity. It wears it down. And the more successful Jimmy appears on screen, the more misleading the image becomes, because it suggests that domination brings stability, when in reality it often creates the conditions for collapse. The illusion of Jimmy Conway is not just about crime. It is about control without consequence. It invites the audience to believe that some men can stand at the center of violence without being changed by it. But that belief is precisely where fiction ends and reality begins to fracture. Because once we step away from the screen and into the life of the man behind the character, the calm disappears, the certainty breaks down, and power reveals itself not as a source of confidence, but as the beginning of paranoia. The real man behind the cool confidence of Jimmy Conway was James Burke, and his relationship with power could not have been more different from the version shown on screen. Burke rose through the criminal world of New York during the 1950s and 1960s, not because he was fearless, but because he was useful. He was organized, efficient, and capable of making money in environments where chaos usually destroyed weaker men. But unlike the fictional character, Burke never enjoyed the protection of full Italian mafia membership, and that single fact shaped everything about how his mind worked. From the beginning, his position was conditional, his safety temporary, and his success always came with an unspoken warning: you can be removed at any time. That insecurity never faded, it intensified. Every promotion, every profitable operation, and every expansion of influence made Burke more visible and therefore more vulnerable. Where the film suggests that power brings confidence, Burke experienced the opposite. Power brought awareness, and awareness brought fear. He knew he could not rely on tradition, bloodlines, or formal rules to protect him. Loyalty around him was transactional, not guaranteed, and that meant trust was always provisional. Over time, this reality began to harden into paranoia, not as an irrational flaw, but as a survival response that slowly consumed his judgment. Burke started to interpret ordinary behavior as signals. A pause in conversation became suspicion. A question became disloyalty. A disagreement became betrayal in progress. The world around him narrowed, shrinking into a constant internal audit of who knew what, who talked too much, and who might cooperate if pressure came down. Unlike Jimmy Conway, who appears surrounded by reliable allies, Burke increasingly felt alone. Even when rooms were full, power stopped feeling like control and started feeling like standing in the open, exposed from every direction. This is the moment where the psychological trajectory changes. Decision-making is no longer guided primarily by opportunity or profit, but by threat avoidance. Burke didn't just plan crimes. He planned against imagined futures, against scenarios that hadn't happened but might. That mindset is corrosive because it rewards preemptive aggression and punishes patience. Every delay feels dangerous. Every loose end feels fatal. The man who once built operations now focused on eliminating uncertainty, and uncertainty, in his world, always had a human face. This is the truth Hollywood rarely shows. Long-term criminal power does not create emotional armor. It strips it away. The pressure does not come in dramatic bursts, but in an endless, grinding presence that reshapes perception itself. By the time Burke reached the height of his influence, his mind was no longer organized around ambition, but around survival. And survival thinking leaves no room for trust. What looks like confidence from the outside was, in reality, a mind already preparing for collapse, convinced that danger was not approaching but already everywhere. The 1978 Lufthansa heist at John F. Kennedy International Airport should have been the moment that secured James Burke's legacy forever. It was, by every measurable standard, a historic success. Millions of dollars in cash, flawless timing, and a level of planning that stunned law enforcement across the United States. In a Hollywood version of this story, this is where the mastermind breathes easy, consolidates power, and enjoys the reward of perfect execution. On screen, success brings relief. In real life, for Burke, success triggered something far more dangerous: panic. The sheer scale of the heist guaranteed attention he could not control, and the attention was exactly what his mind could not tolerate. Instead of feeling triumphant, Burke felt exposed. Every newspaper headline, every rumor on the street, and every question from associates became a reminder that the crime was too big to stay quiet. The money that was supposed to buy security now felt like a beacon drawing law enforcement closer. Where Jimmy Conway appears composed after major scores, Burke's thoughts began to spiral, replaying worst-case scenarios again and again. Who might talk? Who might panic? Who knew too much? The heist did not calm his paranoia. It validated it, convincing him that danger was no longer hypothetical, but inevitable. This is where control truly broke. Burke's response was not to reduce risk, but to erase it, and in his mind, risk had names and faces. Associates connected to the Lufthansa operation began to disappear, not because they had betrayed him, but because they could. Each decision to eliminate someone felt, to Burke, like a rational calculation, a way to seal leaks before they formed. In reality, each killing multiplied pressure, creating more witnesses, more suspicion, and more urgency from investigators. What began as an attempt to secure silence became a cascade of violence that only made silence impossible. The psychological shift was decisive. Burke stopped thinking like a planner and started thinking like a hunted man. Every day without arrest felt temporary. Every calm moment felt deceptive. Trust collapsed completely, replaced by preemptive fear, the belief that waiting was more dangerous than acting. This is the dark inversion Hollywood avoids. The bigger the success, the smaller Burke's world became. Power no longer expanded his options. It narrowed them. The heist that should have ended his climb instead locked him into a state of permanent alert, where survival depended on constant destruction. By the time the dust settled, the Lufthansa money was no longer a prize. It was a curse. It marked the moment when Burke's authority stopped producing stability and started generating chaos from within. The illusion of the calm mastermind could not survive contact with reality, because real power, when paired with constant fear, does not harden resolve. It fractures judgment. And once judgment fractures, every decision accelerates the collapse it is meant to prevent. After the Lufthansa heist, the pressure surrounding James Burke stopped coming from outside and began eating him from within. Law enforcement attention intensified in the late 1970s and early 1980s. But what truly accelerated Burke's downfall was not surveillance or investigations. It was his own mental state. Sleep became irregular. Conversations became interrogations. Every interaction was filtered through suspicion. Where power once allowed him to organize crews and coordinate operations, it now forced him into a constant cycle of threat assessment, scanning faces for signs of fear, hesitation, or disloyalty. Control no longer meant managing others. It meant managing his own panic. This internal shift transformed how Burke used violence. Earlier in his career, force had been instrumental, used to protect business or settle clear conflicts. Now, violence became defensive, then preemptive, and finally compulsive. People were no longer eliminated because they had crossed a line, but because they might. A careless comment, a nervous glance, or simply knowing too much was enough to justify removal. In Burke's mind, killing was no longer about dominance or profit. It was about reducing uncertainty. But uncertainty cannot be eliminated by force, and every act of violence only expanded the circle of fear that trapped him further. As paranoia deepened, Burke dismantled the very network that had once made him powerful. Associates disappeared, crews fractured, and information flow collapsed. Power became isolating because trust was no longer possible. The man who once relied on coordination now operated alone, convinced that isolation was safer than connection. This is the psychological cost Hollywood rarely shows. Sustained power under constant threat does not produce clarity, it produces tunnel vision. Burke's world shrank to a narrow focus on survival, where long-term thinking vanished and every decision was measured only by whether it delayed disaster for another day. Unlike the fictional Jimmy Conway, who maintains composure until the narrative demands collapse, Burke lived inside collapse long before the end arrived. There was no clean turning point, no single mistake, only a gradual erosion of judgment driven by fear. The traits that once made him effective, decisiveness, aggression, and control, became weapons turned against himself. Power stopped being a tool and became a burden, one that required constant vigilance and endless destruction to sustain. By this stage, Burke was no longer building anything. He was consuming his own empire, piece by piece, in an attempt to feel safe in a world he no longer understood. This is the darkest truth of his story. When power is sustained by fear alone, it does not collapse from external attack. It collapses from internal exhaustion. And by the time Burke realized that survival had replaced strategy, there was no structure left to save, only a mind locked in permanent defense against a danger that felt both imminent and everywhere. By the time James Burke reached the final phase of his criminal life, the collapse was no longer theoretical. It was inevitable. The network he had once controlled through organization, intimidation, and profit had been hollowed out by his own actions. Associates were gone, either dead, imprisoned, or emotionally detached, and the silence he had tried to enforce through fear only made cooperation with authorities more attractive. In the end, Burke was not undone by a single rival or a single investigation, but by the cumulative effect of paranoia, violence, and isolation feeding off each other. The more aggressively he tried to protect himself, the more unstable his position became. The decisive blow came not from an external mastermind, but from betrayal born of fear. Men who once relied on Burke for protection now saw him as the greatest threat to their survival. His reputation for eliminating associates made loyalty impossible, because staying close to him meant living under constant suspicion. Cooperation with law enforcement, once unthinkable, became a rational choice. This is the dark irony at the heart of Burke's story. His obsession with preventing betrayal made betrayal inevitable. Where the fictional Jimmy Conway appears betrayed by circumstances, Burke was betrayed by the environment he created himself. As prosecutions mounted and sentences accumulated, Burke's power evaporated quietly. There was no dramatic takedown, no single courtroom victory that symbolized justice served. Instead, his life narrowed into prison walls, failing health, and a slow erosion of relevance. The money was gone, the influence was gone. What remained was a man forced to sit with the consequences of decisions made under fear, rather than clarity. The psychological collapse that began after success now reached its logical conclusion. Power had stripped away everything except survival, and even survival offered no relief. This is where the Hollywood illusion finally disintegrates. Jimmy Conway exists in a world where consequences arrive cleanly at the end, allowing the audience to enjoy the ride without confronting the cost. James Burke's reality offers no such structure. His downfall was not a dramatic fall from grace, but a prolonged unraveling, where each attempt to maintain control accelerated the destruction of everything he depended on. The tragedy is not that he lost power, but that he never recognized when power had already turned against him. In the end, Burke's story exposes the darkest truth behind the Goodfellas myth. Criminal mastery does not end in freedom, wealth, or legend, but in mental erosion, isolation, and self-destruction. He was not defeated by smarter enemies or stronger institutions, but by the internal pressure of a life built on fear. And that is the cost Hollywood rarely shows, because it cannot be romanticized. The moment when control becomes obsession, and obsession ensures that collapse is no longer a possibility, but a certainty. In the end, the difference between Jimmy Conway and James Burke is not intelligence, courage, or ambition, but what power did to their minds over time. Jimmy exists in a cinematic world where confidence survives pressure and control remains intact until the story decides otherwise. Burke lived in a reality where pressure never paused, never reset, and never allowed relief. Every success increased fear, every dollar raised the stakes, and every relationship carried the risk of betrayal. Power did not make him stronger, it made him narrower, more isolated, and less capable of trust. Burke's life exposes the lie at the heart of the Goodfellas fantasy, that mastery over others guarantees mastery over oneself. In truth, prolonged exposure to violence, secrecy, and constant threat reshapes perception, turning rational caution into obsession and strategic thinking into paranoia. By the time his empire collapsed, it had already disintegrated internally. The arrests, sentences, and headlines were only the visible ending of a breakdown that had been underway for years. What destroyed him was not law enforcement alone, but the psychological cost of believing that survival required total control. This is why James Burke's story is darker than any fictional ending. There is no moment of triumph, no clean moral resolution, only the slow realization that power built on fear consumes the person who holds it. When loyalty disappears, when trust becomes impossible, and when every success feels like a threat, collapse is no longer an event, it is a condition. And that is the final truth this story leaves behind. The most dangerous consequence of power is not what it does to others, but what it quietly does to the mind of the person who believes he can never stop looking over his shoulder.